So this video is going to be about the Sony FX6, and I've been using this camera for the last year, and after a trip around the sun, 365 days of cinematic gold out of this camera, I still think this camera is not only the best in its price point, but I do think it's a camera worth waiting for because a lot of you guys are still on that back order list. So let's get into it. I'm somebody that shoots a lot of content around the fitness industry. Now that's working with different influencers, that's working with athleisure companies or supplement companies, covering different events, or even doing some short documentary work for different brands. And I needed a camera that was great for running gun filmmaking, had a lot of great audio options, really good image quality, and just had a lot of the things that you would expect from a cinema camera. And the Sony FX6 fits almost every single one of those needs, except for one very particular situation. Now from a body design standpoint, this camera is actually fairly light when you take it out of the box and it's not rigged up. You still get the audio top handle that you have 2 XLR inputs in there. You do have a bunch of custom dials and buttons, so you have features of the camera you can access just by either turning a dial or pressing a button, which comes in handy. Things like your auto white balance and setting up your Cine EI values or changing your ISO, you can map the variety of buttons on the camera body or any of the handles from the top or the side in order for you to access ththose things pretty quickly. You're also going to get built-in NDs, a feature that a lot of people really want to see in cinema cameras, but it feels like less and less of them actually have them built in. You're also going to get things like timecode when you're working professional audio crews, and you're also going to get things like an SDI import for a more professional, more secure way of monitoring your footage or actually setting it up to a wireless monitoring solution like I actually use with the Atmos Shinobi 7 video that I have on this channel, and you can check that out over here. It's also nice that this is a full frame cinema camera, but it also uses the Sony E-mount. So a lot of those full frame lenses that you have for the Sony E-mount, you're going to be able to use on the Sony FX6. Personally for me, I use my 24-70 Sigma, 20mm, my 35mm G Master, and my 50mm G Master, as well as some of the lens offerings from DZO on this camera. And that's pretty much covered my bases in terms of some of the glass that I pair up with this camera body. Now, some people might disagree, but I actually find it pretty easy to use the menu settings on this camera. Now, you do have a quick menu setup that you can access a lot of the features that you would need right on the fly by just soft pressing on the menu button, and it uses the LCD screen to give you all of those settings that you can toggle and fix to your needs. But if you want to go more in depth, you could actually long press on the menu button and you can really get into the nitty gritty of the settings that are in this Sony FX6 camera. Some of the features that I really like that are exclusive to the Sony FX6 or even just shared between a really small minority of Sony cameras is things like focus breathing compensation, which helps remove a lot of those corner bumps and shakes that you might see while you're racking focus on some of the higher end Sony lenses. Now, something that's exclusive to the Sony FX6, at least in my eyes, it might be on the FX9, but it's something called render cache recording. Now, if you're somebody that shoots in documentary styled videos, this comes really in handy. With render cache shooting, it actually pre-records 10 seconds before you press the record button. So up until 10 seconds, you actually never miss a moment because the camera's actually recording 10-second loops in the background before you press record. So if there's a moment or something that somebody says and you forget to press the record button, once you use render cache recording, you'll actually record the first 10 seconds before that happens, and you end up missing a lot less moments. Now, this camera does not have internal RAW, and that might turn some people off, especially if you're coming from the C70 or the Red Komodo. 2 cameras that I have had before and we'll talk about a bit later, but you have the ability to actually record ProRes Raw on the FX6 externally using the Atmos Ninja 5. Now, if you're somebody that's a DaVinci Resolve user, there is an application where you could actually convert your ProRes Raw into Cinema DNG that you can use on DaVinci Resolve because you can't do it natively. But that feature is really great when you want to get a little bit more in using ProRes Raw. You want to have a little bit more flexibility with your color, or maybe you want to get a little bit of dynamic range out of there. But overall, for me personally, I didn't really see a gigantic difference. The world didn't change for me while using ProRes Raw over the XAVC 10-bit codec that's already in this camera. But if you do want to have some of those features and get into that workflow a little bit, you could still use the ProRes Raw feature on the Sony FX6, and that might help you bridge the gap a little bit in your workflow while you're color grading. Something I can appreciate is the fact that you're able to use different accessories depending on the job that you have. Now, I have evolved a little bit from just doing fitness hype videos into doing more doc work and more branded work, And having a camera that's versatile that I could set it up in a variety of ways became really important. In fact, it's also one of the key factors that have given me more jobs and helped me progress as a video creator and make more money as a filmmaker. So the Sony FX6, although its price tag is around $6,000 US, because it's so versatile, because I can use it in so many different situations, it's actually really started to make my money back. So if you're looking for a camera that's more versatile, I can say after a year of using it, I've used it for pretty much everything. Now, something that the FX6 has that a lot of cinema cameras might not have is going to be autofocus, and actually good, reliable tracking autofocus. Now, I find that in video production, a lot of things you're going to end up doing are going to be interview styled videos. And this is where things like autofocus are going to come really in handy. Now, I'm a big fan of using manual focus to really tell your story and dial in your images, but if you're shooting something like an interview, using something like autofocus where you probably aren't going to be racking too much comes in handy. And I will say that the tracking autofocus, and especially the fact that it's touchscreen on this camera, means that it's really easy to use, it's really reliable, and I've used it on a multitude of professional shoots in my video production and even in my personal projects. Now, when you think Sony, the first thing you're going to think about is this camera's probably a low light beast, and the Sony FX6 is absolutely no different. Now, I'm somebody that shoots in a setting called Cine EI, something you'll learn more about on this channel, but you only have the option of 800 ISO and 12,800 while using S-Log3 in the Cine EI setting. Now, the 12,800 is a very high ISL value, and I don't recommend using that setting in a lot of cameras, but the Sony FX6 in its great low light capability handles it pretty well, and it looks really, really clean. But if you know how to expose for it properly, you're able to make the most out of the low light settings that are in this camera. This is one of those things that I really like about the FX6 because it becomes more of a run and gun camera. Sometimes you don't have access to all the light in the world and you can't sit down and really set up the scene that you need to, and 800 ISO just isn't enough. But the fact that you do have a second base that you can jump up to, you have the ability to actually make the most and not have super noisy footage when you're working in darker areas sometimes. Now, I don't recommend using anything more than 6400 on most cameras, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I do find that using 12,800 when used properly is a really great way to make the most out of your low light situations. Now, I am somebody that edits on DaVinci Resolve, so it makes things a lot easier because you actually have a built-in denoiser that's in there while using the studio version. So if you do have a little bit of noise in your shadows while shooting in low light, you can clean that up native into your program. You are going to have an automatic ND filter that's on this camera. What that basically means is that when you set up the auto ND, when you're walking from outside to inside and everything in between, your camera actually is going to use the electronic ND filter and adjust itself for the situation that you're going to be in. And what I will say is I haven't used it a crazy amount of times, but it does come in handy when I'm moving from outdoors to indoors. Now, I'm going the other way around. Sometimes it gets a little bit wonky, but I will say that this is a really handy feature, especially for somebody that shoots a lot of things outside and the weather changes quite a bit. And what I will say is Sony wasn't the most well known for its color science in previous iterations of their cameras, but I think with the new S-Log3 feature that's on there and the 10-bit color science that's there, the great dynamic range that you're gonna get out of this camera, a lot of these images look extremely, extremely good. It has amazing color, it's great to edit on, the dynamic range is sweet, especially when I have situations where I have a lot of highlights and I have a lot of shadows in the same frame, and as well as what you would see from Sony cameras, you do have great low light performance in there as well. I do find the S-Log3 at 10-bit really easy to work with. It's really easy to color grade. I've made some of my own LUTs and assets. It's really nice to work with and it looks really good. Now, I did mention before that I think this is the best cinema camera in its price point in comparison to some of the other things on the market. And that's not just a speculation. I've actually owned the Canon C70 and the Sony FX6 is actually one of the cameras that made me switch from Canon over into Sony. And at one point I even had the red Komodo while my Sony FX6 was away and I had no problem giving it back and I didn't feel like I missed a ton while getting my Sony FX6 back in exchange for something like the red Komodo. Now, the Canon C70 side of things is an amazing camera. It's really good and you also have the ability to internally record RAW now via SD card. Now, that's a great added feature and it does have things like built-in NDs, great color science, and a smaller form factor, but this camera did have a couple things that I didn't really like. For one, if I had RF and EF lenses, I did have to use an adapter for one or the other. So if I had mostly EF lenses, I did have to go out and buy another adapter to put on the front of my camera in order to have those work. And it didn't become easy to switch from EF to RF mount lenses because you have that adapter. So if I wanted to use an RF prime lens, I'd have to take the adapter off, which was screwed into the body anyways, and switch it to something that was an EF mount. The Sony FX6 has one mount that rules them all, and that's going to be the Sony E mount. So if I have a lens that's for my Sony FX30 or A7 IV, it's going to work on the Sony FX6 so long as that it's full frame. On top of that, and this is a really big turning point for me, is I started working with a bunch of different production companies and a bunch of different different setups, and the camera that I needed to use had to have great low light capabilities. Now, after watching my favorite YouTubers review this camera and tell me about how great it is, especially in low light and how decently it holds up, and I took this out on a professional shoot and I was in a low light situation, I was told that bumping up to something like 6400 ISO was gonna be perfectly fine and everything will be all right. And once I did that, it was a noisy, grainy mess, and it really turned me off the camera because for the type of shoots that I do, sometimes I don't have all the light available to me, and I need something that could perform in low light, and the Canon C70 just wasn't it. My thing overall with the Red Komodo is, although it's great for commercial work, it's what types of commercials and what types of setups and crews you're working with that determine whether or not I wanted to keep this camera, or what I actually ended up doing is I had no problem sending it back. And the Red Komodo might just be a camera that's workflow is a little bit too slow for my taste, or doesn't fit the style of shooting that I actually use it for. When I was using the Red Komodo, I do understand it has autofocus, but it's not the greatest one in the world and not something that I would use professionally. But when I'm shooting the run and gun style of video that I like doing, having autofocus becomes really important, and that's something the Red Komodo just didn't have as well as something like the Sony FX6. On top of that, the camera's amazing and has great quality, but operating in some of the menu settings were just a little bit slower to get to. Things like black shading taking a little bit and your SDI workflow just added a little bit more stress, or maybe hesitate that much more on a shoot day, where things when I'm going really fast paced are just things I don't want to think about and don't have to think about while using the Sony FX6. Now, that isn't to say that the Sony FX6 is the perfect camera, it's just my best option for its price point. There are a couple things that I straight up just don't like about this camera and I think are a little bit whack. Number one is actually scrubbing through footage, because it is incredibly tedious to get yourself to actually scrub back and forth through footage, and a lot of times I end up just skipping clips trying to reverse or even try to fast forward, and the overall workflow in terms of reviewing footage just becomes really tedious and frustrating. And number two, and I've talked about this ad nauseum, but the top handle on this camera, albeit is really handy and useful, the fact that you lose so much not using it becomes incredibly annoying. Now, I've actually taken this camera and used it on my gimbal, the RS2 by DJI. And I actually used this to cover a celebrity event at the Toronto Film Festival down here in Toronto. And when I wanted to get audio at the same time because I wanted the quality out of the FX6 on my gimbal in a shot, I had to settle for either having really bad scratch audio or no audio at all, because once you remove that top handle to get it to balance on the gimbal, you absolutely lose any usable audio that you can use out of this camera. Now, there is a built-in microphone, but like I said, it's kind of trash. If you want to use any sort of decent or professional audio, you just don't have it unless you have a top handle on this camera. On top of that, you actually don't have a 3.5mm jack input on the Sony FX6 either. So if you're somebody that doesn't use XLR microphones to begin with, maybe you're just using a really good 3.5mm jack microphone, there's nowhere to put it on the Sony FX6, which becomes a little bit frustrating. Now, what you can do is you can use a 3.5mm jack to XLR adapter cable, but just like using an XLR adapter cable to mini XLR and the Canon C70, is an extra piece of gear and an extra cable that you might not have planned for that you have to get just to get the base minimum of things that you want to work, like the microphone that you have in your bag already. Overall, who do I think this camera's for, and why do I think this camera is worth waiting for, and why do I think this is the best camera in its price point? First of all, if you're somebody that's getting into cinema cameras, you're leveling up your work, and you need something that's going to be more video centric, that's going to be a workhorse for your production, the Sony FX6 I find is a great option for solo filmmakers, narrative filmmakers, documentarian filmmakers. A lot of you guys that are doing things in a solo one-band man type of scenario, the Sony FX6 not only is a top choice, but based on the fact that it's been back ordered for like 2 years, means that it's worth waiting for, and people are still choosing to do that. I will say that the client perception while using a cinema camera does matter quite a bit. They do like justifying how much money they're spending, and the Sony FX6 has the form factor and the versatility to be rigged out into a big camera for larger production shoots. But I will say that it does have a lot of the features that cater towards small crews and very small production. Nowadays, because videography and cinematography is so accessible, a lot of times you're not going to find yourself in crews of 10, 15, 20 people. You might just have 2 or 3 of the guys that you normally shoot with, and the Sony FX6 is perfect for those scenarios because a lot of the things that you can do only require 1, if not maybe 2 people to operate this camera. I do think this camera is worth waiting for, and I don't think Sony's going to be upgrading this for quite some time. At least if they are, I really hope that they at least fill the orders that they do have, because there's a mile-long back order line and I can't even get a second body to back up the first one. So until they've done that, I really hope, and I don't think they're going to be making an upgrade to the Sony FX6 anytime soon, which means that overall it is worth waiting for because of the comparison between other cameras. You will get great image quality, but if you're somebody that shoots running guns, somebody that works a lot on your own, you might be missing some things that you want out of a camera. And that's where the Sony FX6 comes into play. And after a year of using it, I don't really think I'm going back, unless Sony gives me another camera. That being said, this is the end of the video and my 1-year review on the Sony FX6. If you guys do have any questions about this camera, maybe you're waiting for it as well, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.